Julie Tongs, welcome to Stateline.
Thank you, Adrienne.
Julie, the latest Closing the Gap assessments show the ACT is falling behind in housing and youth incarceration. There are already programs engaging with these issues. Why are they failing?
Look, I think the lack of resources, the lack of services, on the ground services, it's just, I think here in the ACT there's a perception that everybody's wealthy, everybody's okay, but we know that that's not true. I'm not sure how you fix this, but it's up to governments to stop making promises that they don't deliver on and to start to implement recommendations, not just commission another report and let that report and them recommendations sit on the shelf.
As one of the many services then providing services in this space, it'd only be fair then for you to bear some of the responsibility for the ACT falling behind on some of these national targets? You
can't blame Winnunga, because at the end of the day we're not responsible for housing. We've been asking for an Aboriginal housing policy for the last 8 years and still we don't have an Aboriginal housing policy. At the last election we were promised an Aboriginal housing provider. We still don't have that Aboriginal housing provider.
If we look at incarceration for a moment, and in particular youth incarceration, what would you like to see there to further lower this rate?
One child in juvenile detention is one child too many. The majority of the Aboriginal children incarcerated in juvenile detention here in the ACT are under the care of the Director-General. I would like to know how the Director-General is supporting those kids, because those kids are coming out of residential care for which the Director-General has responsibility. They take on all parental responsibility. It's up to them to make sure that them children are safe, that they're warm, that they're not bored, they have activities to do, that the centre doesn't go into full lockdown because of one incident, that those other children, they should be actually being educated, you know. I see too many of our young people that end up in adult prison, that come out of there and they can't read and write. That's shameful. That's absolutely shameful.
Julie, we've spoken a lot about some of the changes you'd like to see, but if there was one key thing that could be done right now, particularly ahead of an ACT election, to lower the rate of Indigenous youth incarceration and also improve housing access here in the ACT, what would that be?
Oh, that's a big question. But I think we need to all come to the table and to sit down, the government and Winnunga, and to look at a different way of doing business. Because whatever we're doing now isn't working. We need to change the way that we do business. And the only way that that's going to change is with the government working with us, not against us.
Minister Rachel Stephen-Smith, thank you so much for joining us on Stateline.
Adie, thank you for having me.
Well, since the Labor government has been in power, since the Closing of the Gap initiative began, why hasn't your government made more progress?
The National Agreement on Closing the Gap and the 4 priority reforms are what is really starting to make a change now. Of course, it's only been a few years and we've really focused on those foundational efforts against the priority reforms. But we are starting to see some change in key priority areas, including in areas like child protection. And I'm pleased to see those changes, but we obviously know that we've got a lot more to do and a long way to go.
And certainly when it comes to young people in detention, that's one of those priority areas. The most recent Closing the Gap report shows the number of First Nations young people in detention is rising. So why are you still failing in this area?
Well, that's a really interesting data point because those numbers go up and down year on year. Over the last 5 years, we're talking about an average of between 2 young people and 5 young people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people in detention in the ACT. So, of course, we want to reduce that level of overrepresentation and, of course, we want to do better. But it's also important to recognise that we're talking about a small number of young people and those numbers, as a result, move around dramatically when they're presented as percentages.
Minister, recently Vanessa Turnbull-Roberts was appointed the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children's Commissioner. Is she based in Canberra?
My understanding is that there's an ongoing conversation with the Justice and Community Safety Directorate. The Commissioner for Children and Young People doesn't sit within my portfolio. It reports to the Minister for Human Rights. But I have heard some concerns from the community about the engagement and the arrangements there, but we're following up on that, and that's really a matter for the Justice and Community Safety Directorate to respond to.
Now, if we turn our attention to housing, the Closing Gap data shows access to safe and secure housing is worsening for First Nations members of our community. Where is your election promise of a First Nations controlled housing body?
So Housing ACT continues to work on working with the community around an Aboriginal community controlled housing provider. My understanding is that there are a number of community controlled organisations that have said they're interested in doing that work, and indeed we do already have some community controlled organisations working in the justice housing space. So that work continues on, and indeed that has been funded through a range of budgets, and we've in this most recent budget committed more than $3 million to continue to support the growth of our community controlled organisations, and that will include organisations in the housing sector.
We have these conversations every single year. The Labor government's been in power since the Closing the Gap initiative began. You must be really frustrated that you're not seeing an upturn in these statistics, that we're not making more progress despite all of that.
Well, I mean, it's frustrating at one level, and at another level, because I have been at the table throughout this process at Joint Council, what I am seeing is genuine progress in those 4 priority reforms, a real change across government in the way that government is working with our community controlled sector. In the ACT, the growth of that community controlled sector, new organisations coming in, organisations growing in child protection, a move over time to partner with and hand responsibility to community controlled partners, an investment in more early intervention. And we're actually seeing in child protection, for example, where those efforts have been ongoing for a number of years, we are seeing that we are moving in the right direction.
Minister Rachel Stephen-Smith, thank you for being with us on State Line.
No worries, thank you.